At certain points of the Russian Civil War, the White armies were seemingly on the verge of victory, having threatened the Bolshevik strongholds of Moscow and Petrograd. But, as history would have it, they were ultimately defeated. The cause of their defeat was arguably set in stone from the very beginning. The White armies operated on the periphery of the old empire, inheriting less industry and population than the Bolsheviks. Given the scarcity of resources, the Whites would have to make everything count. But, as we'll go over, the Whites struggled to rally the support needed to win the Civil War. Before the major campaigns of the war, what would become the White movement was already off to a bad start. In the elections for the Constituent Assembly, non-socialist and right-wing parties obtained between 13% and 15% of the vote. The Bolsheviks alone obtained around a quarter, and, combined with their allies, sat at a respectable 38%. This put the developing White movement at a serious disadvantage, and it would take a tremendous amount of effort to mobilize enough support. The main ideology of the White movement was Russian nationalism. Now, nationalism is very good at uniting a diverse cast of people under a common goal. However, there was one problem. At this time in Russian history, most of the population, that being the peasantry, had a very weak national conscience. At most, peasants identified more with their region rather than the whole country. Russian nationalism was really only a thing of the middle and upper classes. To make matters worse, early Russian nationalism was closely associated with the Tsar. You know, the unpopular ruler who had just been overthrown and was later executed. The main leaders of the Whites, that being the officer corps, had very little in common with the politics of ordinary Russians. In fact, the officer corps was outright distrustful of the masses. There's this paper by Peter Kennis that goes into a lot more detail than what I'm going to, and it just shows how alienated the Whites were from the rest of the population, so I recommend checking that out if you can. Anyways, the already poor image that the Whites had amongst the people only got worse after a series of political and strategic mistakes. Their treatment of the peasantry was one such missed opportunity to mobilize support for their cause. In Siberia, the peasantry was largely made up of small landowners and homesteaders who, historically, had very little conflict between them and the Russian nobility. The Siberian peasantry arguably had a greater sense of private property, and the Whites, who supported private property, could have used this to their advantage. The Siberian peasants were on average much wealthier than their Central Russian counterparts, resulting in many of them being labeled as kulaks by the Bolsheviks. When parts of Siberia was briefly under Bolshevik control in early 1918, the peasants grew frustrated with the government and its controls over the economy. What the Siberian peasantry wanted most was economic freedom and minimal intervention from the state. The Siberian peasantry made for natural enemies against the Bolsheviks, and if the Whites played their cards well, they could have mobilized them for their cause. In a hypothetical scenario, Kolchak's government could have used the fear of Bolshevik grain requisitions and collectivization to rally the peasants to his side. However, his government completely failed to do this and only aggravated the situation. As historian Orlando Figes explains, the image of Kolchak's regime was closely associated with the restoration of the Tsarist system. The Siberian peasants, whose ancestors had fled serfdom, viewed the restoration of the old order as a threat to their freedom and independence. By rejecting the agrarian reform, Kolchak played into the hands of the Bolsheviks, who only needed to spread his words. To make things worse, Kolchak's regime was especially brutal towards the peasants. White forces confiscated whatever they could by force, and to add insult to injury, a lot of these confiscated goods were sold on the black market rather than supporting the war effort. Unsurprisingly, the peasants revolted, with many of these revolts being put down so brutally that any survivors basically had no choice but to join the Bolsheviks. The partisan movement that originated in Siberia, which at times was hostile to the Bolsheviks, did more to hamper the success of the Whites than anyone else. As historian Norman Pereira puts it, the policies of Kolchak's government were self-defeating. In southern Russia, the White Army of Anton Denikin was similarly hampered by the hostility of the peasants. In the Cossack republics of the Don and the Kuban, non-Cossack peasants, mostly Russians and Ukrainians, were basically treated as second-class citizens, suffering from discrimination and violence. Russian officers were obviously appalled by this behavior, but weren't very successful at stopping it. If anything, interference from Russian officers in Cossack affairs only aggravated racial tensions in the region. Essentially, non-Cossacks were pushed into the hands of the Bolsheviks. If the White Russians had been more accepting of giving autonomy to the Cossacks, then maybe they could have been discouraged from persecuting other groups. It also didn't help that their attempts at propaganda were, to put it lightly, pathetic. The Whites underestimated the importance of propaganda, opting to avoid saying anything controversial. Even claiming that they wanted to restore the monarchy was avoided, which not all of them wanted to do anyways, but you get the point. Their stances on major political issues were vague and open to interpretation, which allowed the Bolsheviks to betray their political views in the worst image possible. The vagueness of their politics is best reflected in their plans for Russia's future. Kolchak was concerned first and foremost with military affairs, and his stance on other issues wasn't properly defined. Aside from defeating the Bolsheviks and saving Russia, Kolchak didn't give his soldiers any other reason to fight for him. Even though he claimed that he intended to restore the Constituent Assembly, it can still be argued that he wasn't being entirely sincere. The only logical conclusion an ordinary Russian could have come up with was that the Whites wanted to restore the very unpopular monarchy. Denikin also handled politics in the same way. He claimed to be above it and established a military dictatorship whose sole purpose was to defeat the Bolsheviks. Unlike Kolchak, Denikin never claimed to support the restoration of the Constituent Assembly. He outright said that the conditions brought by the Civil War meant that it was not the right time to solve social problems. Some of his proclamations were even contradictory. He promised to grant local autonomy to the Cossacks while also stating that Russia was one and indivisible. Basically, he had no plan for Russia's future, no incentive for his soldiers other than hatred of the Bolsheviks. All solutions for Russia's many problems would have to be resolved after the war. As you can probably guess, land reform was a serious issue, and its handling by the Whites is a good example of their inability to find solutions. Many of the Whites realized that some sort of land reform was necessary to stop the peasants from ripping them apart. But as seen with Denikin, they wanted to wait till the end of hostilities. It was initially believed that the Civil War wouldn't last that long, and that a White victory could create the conditions to handle this complex issue. To make matters more difficult, the landowning nobility made up a sizable portion of the Whites' base of support. If the nobility weren't willing to compromise during the Civil War, then they sure as hell wouldn't in times of peace. As Kenneth points out, the inaction of the Whites cost them dearly. Only when it was too late did Denikin agree to eventually implement a moderate land reform that would not appease the peasants. The Whites' disgust of politics was responsible for their failure at developing a proper vision for the future. This was largely due to the mentality of the Tsarist officer corps. The educational system that the officers went through was notoriously backwards. A love of learning was never instilled within them, and they were discouraged from discussing political issues. Officers in training never received any lessons related to governance, and were instead taught to follow orders without question. They were indoctrinated to serve Russia as it was. In their minds, the army was above politics, and officers considered themselves as being apolitical even though they really weren't. For them, politics was about participating in political activities, not taking a stance. Russian officers were essentially just serfs in fancy uniforms, perfectly fitting that stereotype of being servile and lacking independence. When the monarchy was overthrown, the Whites didn't have the skill or knowledge required to take over. They were taught to be servants and not to be leaders. Unsurprisingly, Russian nationalists were against the idea of independence for national minorities. Many of the Whites were fighting to preserve the Russian Empire, not to dissolve it. As historian Jonathan Smele explains, the stance of the Whites on the national question was evasive and contradictory. It only damaged their cause as several of the White armies operated from bases in lands inhabited by non-Russians. Denikin would occasionally approve of calls for self-determination whilst insulting minority groups like the Poles and the Ukrainians. Their diplomatic relations with Finland and Poland are a perfect example that shows just how disastrous their stance was. In 1919, Finnish leader Gustav Mannerheim offered his army of 100,000 soldiers to capture Petrograd in exchange for Finnish independence and a few other things. Mannerheim's army was powerful, and certainly larger than what the Whites could muster in the area, and could have made for a great ally. All Kolchak had to do was agree, and he could have destroyed one of the Bolsheviks' largest strongholds. But he refused. Denikin would also fumble when making suggestions for a new Russian-Polish border that offended the Poles so much that they not only refused to join his Moscow offensive, but also halted their military operations, allowing the Bolsheviks to redeploy 40,000 soldiers to face off against him. The problem with their stance on the national question was that the Whites were in no position to make these demands. They were the underdogs of the story, and needed all the help they could get. Even if they defeated the Bolsheviks, their armies were still too small to hold on to the whole empire. Their reluctance to compromise with national minorities lost them several opportunities to form a common front against the Bolsheviks. If they had formed an alliance with the Finns and the Poles, they would have had a good chance of actually winning. Yet, they were too stubborn to take the hit to their pride and let a few territories go. To wrap up the segment on the Whites' failure to mobilize support, I'll quote Figs on the matter. The White leaders failed to adapt to the new revolutionary world in which the Civil War had to be fought. They made no real effort to develop a policy that would appeal to the peasants or national minorities, even though the support of both was essential. Dominated by the narrow vision of the army, they could not grasp the need for mass mobilization in a civil war. Given that the officer corps was not well educated on statesmanship, it should be of no surprise that the administrations the Whites established were deeply inefficient. After becoming leader of the volunteer army, Denikin established a special council to govern the territory he controlled. However, the council only concerned itself with minor issues and failed to create a wider base of support in the areas they controlled. Again, this was the fault of the Whites' lack of interest in politics. To quote Figs again, this time on Denikin's leadership skills, Denikin was a soldier. He came from a military family and had spent his whole life in the army. Politics was foreign to him, and he approached it from a narrow military perspective. The General Staff Academy had not prepared him to think beyond the three basic articles of faith: autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism. Instead of relegating administrative duties to civilians, the Whites often put discredited Tsarist bureaucrats or unqualified officers in charge. Unsurprisingly, the guys who had no love for politics distrusted civilian politicians whose skills could have been utilized. Therefore, the administrations of the Whites were highly incompetent and ultimately contributed to their defeat. I've saved this part for last because it's a no-brainer, but the lack of resources placed the Whites at a key disadvantage, though they at the very least held on to some of Russia's grain-producing regions. If they had set up a proper administration, then the Whites probably could have supplied their armies instead of looting off the countryside. Their already inefficient distribution systems were made even worse by rampant corruption. I briefly touched this subject in a previous video on how it affected the soldiers at the front, but let me tell you that it gets a lot worse. Kolchak's regime was probably the most corrupt. Kolchak himself was living a lavish lifestyle in Omsk while his soldiers marched around Siberia in rags. His offensive largely fell apart because he couldn't get supplies to the front. Corrupt officials would steal everything from cigarettes, uniforms, and even ammunition that found their way onto the black market. It was so bad that even the Bolsheviks were able to steal from them. Trotsky even congratulated General Knox, the head of the British military expedition, by sending him a letter thanking him for supplying the Red Army. Those same incompetent administrators that Kolchak hired to handle supplies were, aside from being corrupt, also wasting time on meaningless assignments. Before she was shipped off to Paris, Kolchak's wife commented that she was surrounded by moral decadence, cowardice, greed, and treason. You'd think that the people who were taught the principles of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism would be a lot less self-serving when fighting against what they perceived as the devil incarnate. But I guess that was too much to ask for. And once again, it only gets worse. World War I killed off the pre-war officer corps. By 1919, only 5% of Kolchak's officers had received training before 1914. The vast majority were recruited as replacements during the war, and hadn't the experience to command an army, let alone rule half a continent. Given their lack of resources, the Whites were very dependent on foreign aid to sustain their war efforts. Though foreign aid allowed the Whites to last as long as they did, intervention was never enough to win the Civil War. Foreign soldiers fought in no major battles and mostly just screwed around behind the front lines. The Japanese were only after their own imperial ambitions in the Far East, whilst the Americans were somewhat timid about their involvement. The British were the most enthusiastic, but even then, they did little to help the Poles in their own war against the Bolsheviks. As historian Evan Mawdsley puts it, intervention was not a disaster for the Allies only because they committed so few resources to it. Getting into the conclusion, the Whites had very little possibilities of winning. Just looking at a map should tell you just how screwed they were. They were spread along the periphery, occupied with their own struggles, and unable to effectively aid one another. In 1919, the armies of Kolchak, Denikin, and Yudenich didn't coordinate their offensives, instead attacking whenever their armies were ready, or in some cases, partially ready. The whites had limited resources and needed to use them efficiently if they wanted to win, but as we've gone over, they didn't. By far the main reason why they lost was due to their complete inability to win over the population. While the Bolsheviks used a mix of the stick and the carrot, the whites used mostly the stick. Even then, they still put up a decent fight, which just goes to show that if they got their act together, they probably could have won. But that would have involved fundamentally changing who the whites were. The biggest tragedy of the Russian Civil War wasn't that the whites lost, but that they couldn't offer a viable alternative to Bolshevism, and that alone could have doomed Russia to further instability and destruction. If you made it this far in the video, then thank you for watching. You can subscribe if you want. I also have a Ko-fi page, and I want to make money from there, so please give me money. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and see you all later. Until next time, goodbye.